He was born in a place no one would expect greatness to emerge from, a small, forgotten town in a stable surrounded by animals and silence. There were no golden cradles, no royal visitors, no kings standing in line to honor his arrival. Only a few shepherds watched by night, guided by a star and a message from the heavens. His mother, a young and humble woman, and his earthly father, a quiet carpenter, had no wealth or power. Yet this child, wrapped in swaddling clothes and laid in a manger, would carry the hope of generations in his tiny heartbeat. His first breaths were not taken in comfort, but in the raw truth of what it means to begin life on the edges of society. This was no accident, it was a divine statement. From the very beginning, his life was a message that greatness is not born in palaces or polished in the courts of power. True greatness grows in silence, in humility, in the soil of surrender. The world has always measured success by titles, possessions, and public applause. But his story flipped the scale. He had no crown of gold, only thorns. No throne, only a borrowed feeding trough. Yet there was something in him that drew wise men from afar, something so compelling that even the skies opened to announce his birth. Humility didn't reduce his glory, it revealed it. He didn't need wealth to be rich. His richness came from purpose. He didn't seek attention, yet people followed him everywhere. He didn't crave status, yet his presence shifted atmospheres. He lived in a time when power was displayed through violence, but he chose gentleness. When rulers demanded to be served, he chose to serve. Even as a boy, while other children played in the streets, he sat with elders, listening, questioning and teaching. His voice didn't thunder, but it pierced deeper than swords. His words didn't flatter, they transformed. What made him so powerful was the absence of pride. He didn't walk with arrogance, but with compassion. He didn't surround himself with the elite, but with fishermen, the sick, the poor, the outcasts, those whom society forgot. He entered homes where others refused to go. He touched people no one dared touch. He called the rejected by name and restored their dignity. This wasn't just kindness. It was a deliberate revolution of love. He didn't just come to lift spirits. He came to lift burdens. And he did it, not from above, but from beside. He never needed to prove his worth. His life proved it. In every step he took, humility led the way. Even when people tried to crown him as king, he withdrew to pray. When crowds shouted his praise, he reminded them that the kingdom he brought was not of this world. He had the power to summon angels, yet he knelt to wash the feet of his followers. In every act, he taught that humility is not weakness, it is strength under control. It's knowing who you are without needing to shout it. It's choosing to lift others, even when you have the right to rise. His beginning in that manger wasn't just a detail, it was the foundation of a truth the world often forgets. That real power does not dominate, it serves. That real leaders do not command from thrones, they walk among the people. That real greatness doesn't shout, it listens. And when the world finally realizes that status and pride are fleeting, the image of a child born in the stillness of night, wrapped in cloth, resting beside animals, remains a silent rebuke to everything we think defines success. His life was a reminder that the most extraordinary souls are often found in the most ordinary places. That the ones who change the world don't always begin with riches, education, or applause, but with a heart surrendered to something greater than themselves. His birth was not just a beginning. It was a blueprint, a way to live, to lead, and to love with humility that transforms everything it touches. As a child, he possessed a stillness in his presence that made people pause, not out of fear, but awe. There was a calm in his eyes that suggested he saw more than anyone else, as though he understood the hidden struggles behind every face. He didn't speak to be heard, he spoke to awaken. In moments when others sought answers from tradition, he asked questions that pierced beyond culture and reached into the soul. People twice his age were captivated, not because he spoke loudly, but because every word he uttered had weight. His curiosity wasn't rebellious, it was refined. His insights didn't come from books or scholars, but from an inner wisdom that confounded the wise. He wasn't trying to impress anyone. He was simply speaking truth, and truth needs no decoration. He sat in temples as a child, not to observe but to teach. While the teachers of the law debated theology, he offered clarity, not with arrogance, but with certainty. His understanding of scripture wasn't learned, it was lived. He didn't memorize words to pass a test, the words lived inside him, and he unlocked them for others. Elders would lean in to hear what this young boy had to say, not knowing that they were listening to the voice that authored the very truths they studied. It wasn't knowledge for the sake of pride, it was wisdom for the sake of transformation. He turned ancient words into living water, and those who were thirsty drank deeply from his insight. His presence exposed how hollow the world's wisdom often was. He had no formal education, yet he knew more than those who spent their lives in study. He didn't quote others to gain credibility. His words stood on their own authority. He carried divine clarity in a world full of confusion. Even as a child, he wasn't distracted by the games of youth or the pursuits of popularity. He saw deeper meaning in everyday moments. He paid attention to things others overlooked. Every question he asked in the temple revealed not just knowledge, but purpose. He wasn't trying to win debates, he was planting seeds in hearts that would grow long after the conversations ended. The people who listened to him often walked away in silence, not because they disagreed, but because they were shaken. Something in his voice reminded them of what they had forgotten. Something in his perspective made their own feel shallow. He wasn't trying to be profound, he simply couldn't be anything less. That's what happens when truth speaks through a life fully aligned with purpose. He didn't need status to be respected. He didn't need age to be taken seriously. He was wisdom wrapped in humility, and that's what made him unstoppable. As he grew older, that wisdom turned into action. He didn't simply speak truth, he lived it. And he didn't wait for perfect conditions to start his mission. He walked into a broken world and offered healing. He didn't avoid pain, he entered it with open arms. While others debated from a distance, he stepped into people's stories. He didn't need a stage or spotlight. His pulpit was the dusty streets, his audience the forgotten, his message one of restoration. He spent time with fishermen, lepers, tax collectors, and women shamed by society. And he never looked at them as projects. He saw them as people. The leaders of his time couldn't understand him. They were trapped by tradition, obsessed with control, addicted to image. But he wasn't playing the same game. He wasn't seeking validation from the powerful. He was inviting transformation for the broken. And he did it without shouting, without threat, without spectacle. When others sought attention, he sought souls. When others demanded honor, he stooped to serve. His wisdom wasn't abstract, it was alive. It wasn't locked in temples, it walked through villages, hands open, heart exposed. There was no separation between what he taught and how he lived. His words had authority because his life was the evidence. Every parable he spoke reflected the way he treated people. Every truth he shared was visible in his actions. He didn't just talk about mercy, he embodied it. He didn't just preach forgiveness, he extended it, even to those who betrayed him. People followed him not because of his miracles alone, but because of the way he carried himself. Calm, confident, and deeply compassionate. That is what made his wisdom unlike anything the world had seen. It wasn't information, it was transformation. And even now, his example continues to challenge every generation to not only speak truth, but to live it with clarity, courage, and compassion. He walked among people not as someone seeking applause, but as one carrying a deeper mission. One that didn't require titles, recognition, or admiration. He didn't come to be served, though every right belonged to him. Instead, he came to serve. His hands, rough from carpentry, reached out to heal, to bless, to lift. While others sat on elevated seats of honor, he knelt beside the broken. While the world chased power, he chased hearts. His authority wasn't enforced, it was felt, naturally and powerfully, in the way he moved through crowds, stopping for the ones everyone else overlooked. He chose companionship with the poor, the hurting, the rejected. He spent time with those society avoided. Lepers, tax collectors, adulterers, the unclean. Not once did he treat them as projects or charity cases. He didn't pity them, he honored them. He sat at their tables, listened to their pain, and restored what the world had stolen from them. Their value. Where others saw shame, he saw stories. Where others saw sin, he saw potential. He didn't see people as they were, but as they could be, and somehow, in his presence, they began to see it too. There was no barrier between him and the people, no bodyguards, no curtains, no formalities, just a man with open arms, walking dusty roads and entering ordinary homes. He didn't need temples or stages. He found sacred ground wherever there was human pain. Even in crowds, he noticed individuals. A woman pressing through a throng, desperate just to touch the hem of his garment. A man blind from birth, ignored by all. A tax collector hiding in a tree, watching from a distance. He stopped for each one. He called them out, not to expose them, but to love them openly. He made them feel seen in a world that had passed them by. He didn't demand perfection before offering love. He didn't require people to change before reaching out to them. His touch came first, and then healing followed. His acceptance wasn't based on what they had done, but on who they were. And once they met him, they were never the same. Not because he scolded them, but because his love disarmed their shame. He didn't silence sinners, he silenced their accusers. He didn't throw stones. He offered second chances. His gentleness wasn't passivity, it was power in its purest form. He was never in a hurry, though the world around him was always rushing. He took his time with people, and that time gave them space to breathe again. They could come to him exhausted, bruised by life, and walk away whole. He wasn't afraid to touch what was considered unclean. He placed his hands where others recoiled. He entered their pain with dignity and left them with joy. When he spoke, he didn't use complicated language to impress scholars. He used stories, metaphors, parables, words that even the simplest listener could understand and carry home in their heart. He was patient with those who didn't understand. Even when his disciples stumbled in their faith, questioned his words, or failed to stand by him, he didn't walk away from them. He stayed. He walked beside them, taught them again, reminded them of who they were becoming. His leadership didn't come from dominance, it came from relationship. He knew every weakness they carried, yet he still called them to follow him, not because they were ready, but because he believed they could become something greater. He challenged the proud, not with anger, but with truth. He confronted those who wore holiness as a mask while ignoring the suffering of others. He never tolerated injustice dressed as religion. He didn't allow tradition to get in the way of compassion. Rules mattered to him, but people mattered more. And every act of kindness he showed was a statement to the world that every person matters and no one is too far gone. What made him different wasn't just what he said, it was how he lived it out. He walked what he taught. He loved those the world forgot. He lifted the ones cast aside. And he never demanded that people rise to his level. He met them right where they were and walked with them until they could stand. His leadership was not made of commands, but of footsteps worth following. Every action, every word, every gesture was filled with grace. He didn't change people by force, he changed them by presence. And even in silence, his life spoke louder than any sermon ever could. He didn't teach love as a concept, he lived it as a daily decision. His love was not shallow or convenient, it was relentless, radical, and often uncomfortable to witness. He loved not just those who followed him, but those who mocked him, betrayed him, and plotted against him. He extended grace to those who didn't deserve it, mercy to those who had failed, and compassion to those the world had discarded. While others placed conditions on their kindness, he broke every barrier of tradition, class, and morality to offer love without limit. This wasn't the love the world was used to. It was something divine in its depth and human in its touch. He spoke of loving your enemies, not just tolerating them. He called people not to vengeance, but to forgiveness. His words weren't empty ideals. They were instructions for a better way to live. In a world consumed by revenge and divided by hatred, he preached a message that turned every known value upside down. He taught that those who curse you are to be blessed, those who hurt you are to be prayed for, and those who take from you are not to be resisted with hate, but met with generosity. It was a love that cost something. A love that demanded the surrender of ego, pride, and the desire for control. He didn't avoid the outcasts. He made them the center of his attention. When the religious elite kept their distance from the impure, he moved closer. When others whispered about sinners, he dined with them. He embraced the leper, defended the woman caught in adultery, and praised the faith of a Roman centurion. In every case, he looked beyond the label the world had given them and saw the humanity they still carried inside. His love broke rules, shattered walls, and rebuilt broken people from the inside out. Where others drew lines, he erased them. Where others built fences, he opened gates. Even when he was tired, grieving, or under pressure, love was still his default. When the crowds became overwhelming, when his disciples misunderstood him, when enemies plotted against him, he never turned his back in bitterness. He remained rooted in compassion. His patience stretched beyond human limits. He saw not just who people were, but who they were meant to become. His love didn't excuse wrongdoing, but it always offered redemption. He spoke truth boldly, but never without tenderness. His voice could challenge the heart and still heal it at the same time. He wept with those who wept. He wept with those who wept. He wept with those who wept. He wept to offer solutions. He stepped into it. He wasn't afraid of brokenness. He wept to offer and fail. He was unafraid. He wept through suffering. He wasn't because he knew love had the power to restore what pain had shattered. When others sought justice by punishment, he offered justice through restoration. He didn't ignore sin, but he also didn't let sin define a person. He called people to change, not with threats, but with love so pure that it made them want to be different. He didn't manipulate, pressure, or coerce. He invited gently and powerfully. His love was a mirror that revealed truth, a light that exposed darkness, and a shelter that offered rest. People didn't come to him because they were forced. They came because they were seen, known, and still accepted. He loved across boundaries, racial, political, gender, and moral. Where society had drawn borders, he walked freely. He spoke with women in public, honored children, touched the sick, and affirmed the worth of foreigners. He loved those considered cursed, those labeled unworthy, those silenced by shame. And that love was never passive. It was action, it was movement, it was presence. It healed wounds, opened eyes, and gave people the courage to stand tall again. He didn't just love the lovable, he loved those who would betray him. He washed the feet of the very man who would sell him out. He prayed for the soldiers driving nails through his hands. He asked forgiveness for those who spat on him and mocked him as he hung, bleeding. That kind of love defies logic. It breaks every human instinct for retaliation. And yet, that is the love he embodied. Complete, unearned, and unstoppable. A love that continues to speak louder than any law, louder than any fear, louder than any failure. He stood before power not with swords, but with silence and conviction. In a world where dominance ruled and fear was the language of authority, he introduced a new kind of strength. One rooted in peace, not violence. He could have summoned angels, commanded the elements, or spoken words that would silence every accuser. But he didn't. He didn't need to. His strength wasn't measured in volume, but in stillness. He wasn't threatened by those in charge because he knew who he was and why he had come. When confronted by religious leaders, questioned by political authorities, and mocked by crowds, he remained calm, composed, and unshakable. His authority came not from position, but from purpose. While others wielded power to control, he used it to liberate. He didn't bend people to his will, he invited them into freedom. He didn't manipulate minds, he transformed hearts. His presence alone disrupted systems built on fear and exploitation. He challenged those who had twisted religion into rules without compassion. He saw how pride, greed, and control had corrupted the sacred, and he called it out, not with fists, but with truth. He overturned tables in temples, not to cause chaos, but to cleanse what had been desecrated. His boldness was never for show, it was for justice. He spoke to the powerful without trembling, yet he never became what he opposed. He didn't mirror their arrogance, their cruelty, or their lust for control. He remained grounded in love and anchored in truth. He confronted leaders not to destroy them, but to awaken them. He exposed hypocrisy without hatred. He stood for the oppressed, not just in words, but in action, risking his safety, his reputation, and eventually his life. That is what made his defiance holy. It wasn't rebellion for rebellion's sake, it was resistance rooted in righteousness. Even when people tried to crown him as king by force, he refused. He knew their idea of a leader was someone who would overthrow governments, crush enemies, and rule with might. But he had no interest in building an earthly empire. His kingdom was not built on conquest, but on compassion. Not on domination, but on redemption. He could have had armies. Instead, he had friends. Simple, flawed people who followed him not out of fear, but love. He walked unarmed into danger, not because he was naive, but because he trusted the power of peace more than the illusion of control. When others expected vengeance, he extended grace. When others anticipated retaliation, he offered healing. His enemies plotted in secret, but he lived in the open. He didn't hide, he didn't flinch, he didn't retreat. He walked straight into conflict with his head held high and his heart wide open. His courage wasn't loud, it was steady. He didn't boast of victories, he carried burdens. He didn't crush opposition, he carried a cross. He wasn't afraid to be misunderstood, rejected, or hated. He knew that standing for truth in a broken world meant being targeted. Yet he never wavered. He faced betrayal not with bitterness, but with forgiveness. He didn't let the pain harden him. He remained tender, even as the storm gathered around him. His power wasn't in resisting suffering, it was in transforming it. He taught that true strength is not the absence of pain, but the ability to carry it with grace. His resistance didn't come from anger, but from clarity. He knew who he was, he knew why he was sent, and because of that, nothing could shake him. He didn't chase approval, he didn't perform for applause, he didn't beg for loyalty, he lived free of ego and full of purpose. And that freedom made him untouchable, not because harm couldn't reach him, but because fear couldn't control him. Even when arrested, beaten and sentenced, he didn't protest with rage. He didn't curse his captors. He looked at them with compassion. He saw beyond their actions and into their humanity. That's what power looks like when it's purified. He could have walked away, but he chose to stay. He could have destroyed his enemies, but he chose to forgive them. His control wasn't about overpowering others, it was about mastering himself. He didn't need violence to prove his authority. His peace shook empires. His truth silenced deception. His love made rulers nervous. And his cross, the very symbol of defeat, became the greatest display of victorious restraint the world has ever known. He knew what was coming. He spoke of it long before it arrived, not as a man gripped by fear, but as someone fully aware of the path he had chosen. Every step he took brought him closer to betrayal, suffering, and death, yet he never turned away. The cross was not a surprise to him. It was part of the mission he carried with unwavering resolve. He walked toward it with open eyes and an open heart, not because he had no other choice, but because he made the choice. The pain that awaited him wasn't hidden. It was prophesized, visible, and certain. Still, he chose the road of sacrifice. His love wasn't passive. It was fiercely intentional. He had the power to avoid it all. One word from him could have changed everything. He could have defended himself, called upon legions of angels, escaped into the shadows, or simply disappeared from the public eye. But he didn't. He remained. When others would have run, he stayed. When others would have fought back, he submitted, not out of weakness, but out of strength. The kind of strength that doesn't need to win in the eyes of the world to accomplish something eternal. The cross was never forced upon him. It was embraced. Every lash, every insult, every drop of blood, he bore it with purpose. In the garden, when the weight of what was coming pressed down on him like a crushing stone, he prayed, not to escape, but to surrender. He wrestled in agony, sweating drops of blood, but in the end, he spoke the words that changed history. "Not my will, but yours be done." That wasn't a moment of defeat, it was the pinnacle of obedience, the kind of obedience that costs everything, the kind that doesn't ask for comfort, but for courage. He didn't pretend the suffering didn't matter, he faced it. He felt every ounce of it, but he also saw beyond it, to what it would accomplish. He didn't die because he was overpowered, he died because he was overflowing with love. The nails didn't hold him to the cross, love did. Love for a broken world, for lost souls, for those who didn't even know they needed saving. His death wasn't the end of a plan gone wrong. It was the fulfillment of a plan perfectly carried out. He chose the path of pain so that others could walk the path of peace. He took the punishment so that others could receive the promise. The crowds that once shouted his name turned against him. The hands that once reached for healing clenched into fists of hate. The very people he had fed, healed, and taught cried out for his crucifixion. And yet, he didn't curse them. He didn't blame them. He carried the cross through the streets they walked. He staggered under its weight, bloodied and bruised, yet never bitter. The same hands that touched blind eyes and raised the dead now gripped rough wood as soldiers beat him, mocked him, and crowned him with thorns. Even then, there was no hate in him, only mercy. As he hung between two criminals, suffering a death reserved for the worst, he offered forgiveness, not just to them, but to everyone. "Father, forgive them," he said, "for they do not know what they are doing." Who speaks like that in the face of cruelty? Who prays for their executioners with their dying breath? Only someone whose love runs deeper than pain. Only someone who came not to condemn, but to save. His final moments were filled not with anger, but with compassion. He spoke hope into a thief's last breath. He entrusted his mother to the care of a friend. He declared that his mission was finished, not defeated, but fulfilled. Everything about his suffering was a statement, a declaration that love isn't proven in comfort, but in sacrifice. That the greatest victories are not won by force, but by faithfulness. That the deepest impact doesn't come from what we avoid, but from what we're willing to endure for the sake of others. He didn't ask for admiration, he gave his life. He didn't demand loyalty, he poured himself out completely. What the world saw as humiliation was actually glory in disguise. What looked like weakness was the greatest act of strength. And through every moment of agony, he never lost sight of his purpose. His suffering was not in vain. It was the gateway to hope, the price of redemption, the ultimate act of selfless love. He carried the weight of humanity's brokenness on his shoulders and bore it all, not because he had to, but because he chose to. The silence of the grave was not the end. It was a pause before the world would witness the most powerful moment in human history. The stone that sealed the tomb was not strong enough to contain the purpose he carried. The guards that stood watch were not alert enough to stop what was destined to happen. Darkness had its moment, but it was never in control. And early in the morning, when hope seemed buried and grief hung heavy in the air, the impossible happened. He rose. The breath returned to his lungs. The light filled his eyes, and the one who had been pierced by nails stood again. Not as a memory, but as the living proof that death had lost its grip. His resurrection wasn't just a miracle, it was a revolution. It shattered the final boundary the world had ever known. Death, the great equalizer, the inevitable end, was no longer the final word. He walked out of the tomb not quietly, but with heaven's authority pulsing through his veins. The very wounds that had marked him for death now testified to his victory. The scars on his hands and feet weren't erased. They were transformed. What once represented pain now carried the story of redemption. The cross had done its worst, and still he rose. Those who had doubted him were stunned. Those who had mourned him were speechless. He appeared not in fury, but in peace. He didn't seek revenge on those who abandoned or betrayed him. He greeted his followers with words of reassurance. "Peace be with you." That was his response to fear. That was his answer to failure. He entered rooms that were locked by fear, not to rebuke, but to restore. He showed his wounds, not to gild them, but to prove that love had gone all the way through suffering and come out alive. His resurrection wasn't for spectacle, it was for transformation. He returned to remind them of the mission, to rekindle their courage, and to reveal that the story wasn't over. Everything he had spoken about now made sense. The veil had been torn, the power of sin broken, and the grave had lost its finality. He walked and talked with his followers again, not as a ghost or legend, but as the living, breathing Savior who had conquered the last enemy. He wasn't just alive, he was triumphant. He met his friends on roads, by the sea, in their moments of doubt and disillusionment. He didn't demand faith, he offered presence. He invited Thomas to touch his wounds. He cooked breakfast for the ones who had gone back to fishing. He walked alongside two followers who couldn't recognize him until he broke bread with them. In every post-resurrection appearance, there was one consistent theme: restoration. He didn't return to relive the past, he returned to awaken the future. He gave his followers a mission, not one of revenge or religious dominance, but one of hope, healing, and light. "Go," he said, "and make disciples of all nations." His resurrection wasn't a private moment. It was the beginning of a movement. A movement that would spread not by force, but by faith. Not through power, but through love. The tomb had been empty, but their hearts were now full of courage, full of fire, full of a new kind of purpose the world had never seen. The world changed that day. Hope was no longer a wish, it was a certainty. The fear of death no longer held the same weight, and every story that ends in despair now had a reference point: the resurrection. It became the evidence that no darkness is final, no loss is absolute, and no soul is beyond revival. The early believers didn't just talk about what he taught. They couldn't stop talking about the fact that he was alive. That truth became the center of everything they did. They faced persecution, prison, and death with boldness because they had seen the one who walked out of the grave. His rising didn't erase suffering, but it redefined it. Pain no longer had the last say. Loss was no longer without meaning. Death was no longer a wall, it was a door. And his followers would carry that truth to the ends of the earth, telling everyone who would listen that life had won, not just once, but forever. That empty tomb continues to echo through time, a permanent reminder that what looks like the end might only be the beginning. And in his rising, a new way of living was born, one filled with power, purpose, and the unwavering promise that love is stronger than death. His legacy wasn't written on scrolls alone, nor carved into stone monuments, or echoed in the chambers of palaces. His legacy lived in people, in changed hearts, in transformed lives, in those who once were lost, but now walked with light in their eyes. He didn't leave behind wealth, armies, or a crown of gold. He left behind love that spread like wildfire, truth that set people free, and a movement that outlasted empires. He didn't ask for statues to be built in his honor. He built something more powerful. A community of followers who carried his spirit, his teachings, and his compassion to the corners of the world. Every person he touched became a living testimony. Not perfect, not polished, but transformed. Fishermen became fearless preachers. Tax collectors turned into generous givers. The broken became whole. The outcast became part of a family. The cowardly found courage. It wasn't magic. It was the result of an encounter so personal, so deep, that it rearranged everything. His influence didn't end with his voice, it continued through the voices of others who had been forever changed by him. He didn't just teach principles, he gave people purpose. He didn't pass on power through bloodlines or dynasties. He passed on identity, an invitation to be part of something eternal. He called people to more than survival. He called them to mission, to love the unloved, to speak for the voiceless, to serve instead of dominate, to forgive when the world says to hate. His movement wasn't one of force, but of fire, burning in the hearts of those who had seen what real love looked like. They didn't just remember what he said, they remembered how he made them feel, seen, known, forgiven, free. Even after he left the earth physically, his presence remained through their lives. The miracles didn't stop, the healing didn't end, the hope didn't dim. Through ordinary people came extraordinary acts, acts of kindness, of courage, of radical generosity. And it wasn't done in his memory alone, it was done in his name. By the same power that raised him from the grave, his spirit moved through them like wind, unseen, unstoppable, undeniable. Generation after generation, his story passed not just from mouths but from hearts. The message didn't weaken with time, it grew. Through persecution it spread, through hardship it strengthened, through silence it spoke louder. Rulers tried to erase him, empires tried to bury him, skeptics tried to discredit him, yet every time his name was whispered with faith, something stirred. A broken heart mended, a lost soul found light. A weary spirit stood up again. Because what he began was never about religion. It was about resurrection, about restoration, about reconnection between humanity and the divine. He left behind no writings of his own, yet billions have read about him. He never traveled far from his homeland, yet his influence circles the globe. He lived just over 3 decades, yet split history in 2. He didn't study in the great schools of his time, yet his words continue to be studied by scholars, saints, and seekers. His teachings, so simple a child can understand, yet so deep that a lifetime of study barely scratches the surface. He redefined what it means to lead, to love, to live. His memory is not frozen in the past, it is alive in every act of compassion, in every step toward justice, in every heart that chooses forgiveness over vengeance. He left no institution, but inspired the birth of movements that built hospitals, fed the hungry, clothed the poor, and sheltered the outcast. His followers didn't grow in power through war or conquest, but through humility, endurance, and faith. They sang in prison cells, they forgave their persecutors. They laid down their lives, not for profit or recognition, but because they had found something worth dying for, and more importantly, something worth living for. Across languages, cultures, and centuries, his name continues to be a refuge for the weary, a fire for the passionate, a path for the lost. He didn't just change the world once, he continues to change it every day, one heart at a time. And his legacy will never be measured by the standards of this world, but by the transformation he sparked in the quiet places of the soul. What he began was not a religion, but a revolution of love. And that revolution is still unfolding.